Recording in progress. Oh, you need to turn off my. How do we do it? Because it's not the normal controls. We good?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Amber Huff, and I am co-leader of the Resource Politics and Environmental Change Research Cluster at IDS. Thanks very much for coming to this seminar. I'd like to welcome Emma Jane Lord, sitting beside me. She is a PhD candidate at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and the Humanities at the University of Bergen in Norway. And she's writing her dissertation entitled Misframing Deforestation, Policy Evaluation of REDD+ in Kigoma, Western Tanzania. Her research interests are environmental justice and dimensions of land use change, particularly in Africa and Latin America. For instance, she's interested in forced evictions within the tropical conservation industry and internal displacement in Colombia. She began research in this study area that she'll be talking about today in 2014 as part of her master's degree, and she continues to research today. Emma's talk is titled Land Tenure and the REDD+ Paradox, How Value Grabbing Recentralized Forest Governance in West Tanzania. This talk is based on an article she's currently writing for a special issue of Political Geography that's titled The Grabbed Institution, Revisiting the Political Ecology of Resource Corruption. Considering the high stakes for governments and financial actors on one side, and for the lives and livelihoods of people who get drawn into market-based mitigation schemes like REDD+ and carbon forestry, critical research into contestation, conflicting notions of value, and changing nature-society relationships related to climate mitigation and other areas of conservation policy is more important than ever. This is particularly so for studies that push beyond documenting local impacts, but use localized dynamics and impacts as an epistemic gateway to testing and questioning many core assumptions about things like marketization, property rights, development, and social change in a changed and changing world. Forest carbon has been called a pseudo-commodity, meaning offsetting schemes such as REDD+ can increase the value of tropical forest gained from development rent, even where integration into an imagined global carbon market is never achieved. This article, or this talk based on the article, discusses through a case-based approach the consequences of such effects in relation to debates on the potentially recentralizing effects of REDD+ and the reconfiguration of land tenure and property rights in Tanzania. It presents an empirically grounded study of how a REDD+ pilot project in Kigoma exacerbated boundary conflict after implementation on a forested land area, without first definitively establishing land tenure and property rights. This highlights the need for future forest policies to prioritize questions of land tenure, political accountability, and context-specific interactions of forest users before technical conditionalities that involve biophysical measurement of trees to estimate forest carbon densities. And with that out of the way, I would like to hand it over to Emma. And we'll have questions, time for questions and comments after the talk. But do feel free, if something occurs to you in the meantime, to go ahead and put a question in the chat box if you're joining online.
Okay, thank you so much, Amber, for that introduction, and thank you to IDS for hosting this seminar. And to Alec Williamson, Christian Mickelson Institute for coordinating the special edition. So shall we put the slides up on the screen? Yeah, and thank you all for attending as well, both in person and on Zoom. Okay, so I've changed the title to Land Tenure Conflict and the REDD+ Paradox to reflect the fact that there is a large conflict in this case as in other areas. And the main finding is that forest governance has been recentralized and that there is a land tenure conflict. And I explain this using the concept of value grabbing mainly, while also acknowledging that there's ideologies involved. So value grabbing, there's a recent debate within political ecology that the role of rent has not been analyzed enough compared with sites of accumulation. So there's been a lot of critical literature on carbon markets as sites of accumulation, but certain scholars, including Anglucci et al., Feli 2014, have highlighted the role of rent. So Feli says carbon markets are not new sites of accumulation, but rather emissions allowances are both a limitation and a right to access. Entitlements to emit greenhouse gases are not commodities, but they're essentially trying through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol. There was an attempt made to regulate capitalism and capitalist accumulation of profits through industrialized processes, and also attempts by individual nations to escape that limitation. So then we have a tension or contradiction between these two processes. So he draws a parallel between land and the entitlement to emit greenhouse gases, whereas we need labor and inputs to create commodities from land. The land itself can extract value through rent, and so can emission entitlements. But certain commodities such as palm oil and biofuels can cause green grabbing. So commodities can cause grabbing, but we need to pay attention to what is a commodity and what is rent. Grabbing in general is defined by Sir Eden Williams as when someone seizes something that he or she is not entitled to, or takes more than what is his or hers formally, informally, or tacitly allocated share. And this raises a distributional question of who decides, like who decides who gets what. So if the grabber is also in possession of the authority to define who has the rights to the resource they're about to take, then the law cannot hold them accountable. And if corruption is defined in relation to the breaking of a given law, which isn't the only way to define it, but it's a typical way that corruption can be understood, corruption isn't as useful a concept for discussing perspectives of communities whose rights are in dispute, and when laws are being openly or latently contested, as is happening in this case. In other words, the law is not always just, so grabbing can therefore become a useful concept. And when land tenure is unclear and insecure, assessments of legality become relativistic. Yeah, and I put this photo here to demonstrate that there have been justice or social justice movements, the climate justice movement, who have campaigned on this, that forests should not be commodified, or maybe she's a political ecologist campaigning for the appropriate interpretation of Marx's theory of value. So there's typically a distinction between customary versus statutory law in Africa. In Tanzania, the courts recognize statutory, customary, and Islamic law, and we call this legal pluralism. Whereas property rights have been defined as the products of rules as mediated by formal and informal institutions which liberate and constrain human action, land tenure is defined more broadly as the full sets of institutions and policies that determine how the land and its resources are accessed, who can hold and use these resources, for how long, and under what conditions. So there's a distinction within the land tenure literature between clear and unclear land tenure and secure and insecure land tenure. So clear or unclear, do we know what the law says? And secure versus insecure, is there enforcement? Is the state supporting local people, for example, in terms of customary land rights? And we need to disaggregate different kinds of property rights, ownership, access, and use rights, and understand that power inequities tie property rights to authority. So the act of authorizing a property relation legalizes the rights to property and simultaneously legalizes the authorizer. So these concepts help us to understand the interaction between wealthy conservation organizations and the state, and further marginalization and exclusion of poor peasants and enclosures of previously common pool resources. What is forest carbon exactly? A global carbon market hasn't been established for trading in the way that it was once envisioned, but nevertheless, there has been substantial investment. So participation, decentralization have been important concepts within forest governance. And the theory behind this is that recognizing the formal land rights of villagers at the local scale will install a sense of, or may install a sense of ownership and responsibility towards natural resources that can encourage their sustainable management, but it's not a predictable process at all. And outcomes may be at the cost of loss of livelihoods for the poor who otherwise created income from forest products. This is being shown in Tanzania and other countries. Democratic decentralization is about the downwards accountability of the governance processes. Often this can be through elections, but it doesn't have to be through elections. And there's been recentralization effects shown in many cases in Africa, Asia, and many continents, from the state taking back power that policies have attempted to decentralize. And the institutional choice and recognition framework highlights also the role of other actors such as NGOs, meaning non-governmental institutions, and that this is broader than just being about the state, which is institutional choice is already in the recentralization framework, because institutional choice is one of the mechanisms that of recentralization. So we need to know what REDD+ stands for, reducing emissions through deforestation and forest degradation. And just a bit of brief background on that. It's a global forest carbon foresting offsetting policy. The literature on REDD+ is quite vast, but there have also been voluntary offsetting policies and other forms of carbon forestry. Reducing deforestation was argued to be an effective and economically viable target for mitigating climate change. Jens Stoltenberg, who was then the Prime Minister of Norway in 2007, is quoted as saying, everybody knows how to not cut down a tree. But in 2009, the Copenhagen Accord evaded binding commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there's no obligation for nations to invest in REDD. Most of the financing has been from bilateral, multilateral, and private donors. And this has caused Angelson et al. To write that it's become a light form of result-based aid, and it doesn't take the form which was typical to payments for ecosystem services projects previously. In fact, REDD+ is very heterogeneous in how it's been implemented from place to place, and it's very context specific. I'll just mention briefly that there's a growing scholarship on the role of conflicts in REDD, this recent review, for instance, and previous selected works. And this is by no means a comprehensive account. And Amber has summarized some of the issues involved quite concisely in her policy brief, understanding relationships between the green economy, resource financialization, and conflict, arguing that inequitable property regimes increase potential for conflict. Research should identify risk of conflict, inform protocols for avoiding or mediating conflict situations, which I completely agree with, and I'll write about that in my next paper. But this case study speaks more to the first point and the need for equity mechanisms to be established for REDD, and also the question of involuntary resettlement not being acceptable and decision-making. So the REDD+ paradox came up in the literature in 2010. There's other scholars such as Phelps et al. Who also argued or predicted that REDD+ would recentralize forest governance. And this was around the time that the REDD projects, this REDD+ project was already underway. And this was one of the earliest REDD+ projects that actually reached the ground in Tanzania. Tanzania was one of the earliest countries that was implementing REDD+ projects on the ground. So Sambrook et al. Predicted that forest governance would be recentralized by REDD+, but this was contested by Sven Wunder, who's an economist. And this could be understood as an example of complexity blinding. So different languages of valuation coming into play, the economic language of valuation, erasing the political processes that are taking place in the field. So in Tanzania, these are the levels of government. At the village level, there's also a general village assembly comprising of all the adults in a village. And between the district and the village level, there's two intermediary levels, the ward and the division officer. The division officer is appointed by the district. So this is an example of deconcentration of power, whereas the village assembly, and there's a village chairman who is elected. In principle, this could be a democratic, decentralized structure, but that requires recognition from the higher levels and other actors, powerful actors, such as international actors who are in the field. I should also mention the land categories. Broadly speaking, and this is summarizing it quite quickly, there's reserve land categories, national park, game reserves, etc. And then there's village land, and there's a category called general land, which is not incorporated into the other two. And there's a history of participatory forest management in Tanzania, which takes the form community-based forest management, which it takes place on village land, and joint forest management, which takes place in the reserved land categories of national parks, game reserves, etc., but including the villages in those processes. Here's the location of my study site in the west of Tanzania, where you see that black arrow pointing next to Lake Tanganyika. And these red dots on the map are, or patches on the map, are the other REDD+ pilot projects. Here's a close-up of the study area. Here you see Gombe Stream National Park, where the research on chimpanzee observations took place, and Msitu Ugala to the south of Kigoma and Uvinza is the study area of the REDD+ pilot project. And this area has wild chimpanzees, and it's been argued that the gene flows from these chimpanzees are necessary to breed with the chimpanzees in Gombe. So it's important in terms of biodiversity conservation, particularly for chimpanzees, and it's a Miombo woodland. It's also a populated area. These were the REDD+ villages, which I've highlighted in red. There's 6 along the lake shore and 1 inland called Songambele. And Songambele and Sonuko were sites of a lot of conflict, but not the only sites of conflict. So there's also Kazakati and Mwasha, which were boundary conflict areas. It's among the lowest socio-economic status in Tanzania in Kigoma region. The drivers of deforestation are cultivation, charcoal production, agro-pastoralism. So no huge agro industries here. It's poor people making their livelihoods. And this is the REDD+ pilot area, and also some photos from my fieldwork. So I did in-depth interviews, many of them individual, well, most of them individual interviews, although I have a photo of larger gatherings here. And I did archival work, but I went into the village records, the district records, and got documents which are not easy to get and to copy when there's no electricity for the photocopy and things like this. So the first data collection, as Amber mentioned, was during my master's thesis in 2014, and I went back in 2018, 2019. In 2018, I was in other parts of Tanzania talking to key informants. So there was participatory land use planning carried out in 2008 prior to REDD. REDD started from 2009, but it really got going in 2010. And we can see from the shape of Songambele, that's the village in the forest, that this map is not a natural shape. And if there'd been a participatory process of walking the boundaries with the leaders, you would expect it to not to be quite so square or angular. You'd expect more of a natural shape. And the interviews revealed that the leader of this village carried out land use planning without the people being involved or without them knowing about it. And there was a change. He didn't get re-elected. And then the next chairman of Songambele seemed to be much more accountable to his people and much more sympathetic to their concerns. But he had to live with the boundaries that had been put in place by the previous chairman. So it seems to me from this field work and other literature that I've compared it to, that there's a pattern that some chairmen are more accountable than others to their people. Whereas in Sunuka and Songambele, the chairman supported the people who complained. In Kilando, there were people complaining and the chairman wasn't sympathetic. So let's talk about the pilot project implementation. This project was implemented on general land, and this is quite unique to this pilot project, although in other cases such as Lindsay, the project has been implemented on village land, but they've also tried to include areas to the side of village land or forests on village land which were not in the village forest reserves. There was a community-based organization, as in other pilot sites of REDD+, and they took the village environmental committees and put them together into one organization. And this happened in other sites. They took forest monitors from the 7 REDD+ villages. And by the way, these villages have expanded into more villages since 2014. They've approximately doubled in number because there's a process of new sub-village and village creation, whereas sub-villages aren't formally recognized, but villages are. What they called motivation money was on the basis of forest patrols and engagement with REDD+. So in this pie chart, this was the project's evaluation of how much the forest monitors had participated. And the orange dots on this map are the REDD+ forest monitors. And there was also another conservation project, which represents the blue dots, running at the same time before and afterwards. So running alongside. So there was different kinds of forest monitors working together in the field. They more or less collaborated, but they were accountable to, they received instructions from different people. The payments were used for infrastructural development, schools and village offices, and there was a free, prior and informed consent exercise. The community-based organization discussed forest protection rules in the village assemblies. So whether this is really discussion or consultation is a question that's been asked. So one of the main findings is that there's been forced evictions, and therefore a land tenure is insecure. The group of farmers who were evicted have some local documents saying that they've been recognized by the village level, not the district level. So that gives them less security. But nevertheless, it's still some evidence that they've been there for more than 12 years. So according to the Land Act, if people farm an area, even if it's on general land for more than 12 years, they should have some recognition and they should have compensation according to the Land Acquisition Act. And this is a photo which shows the kind of houses people lived in 2014 and the houses in 2014 that they were reconstructing. It's my photos. After the houses had been burnt down by the forest patrols. So the forest patrols were quite violent. They burnt their crops, they beat people, and they slashed crops and took property. And the boundary conflicts have a lot of data on this, but I'm summarizing by saying Songambele village extended their boundaries in 2010 and received a letter from the district saying that their request was approved. However, no map was brought, and this led to a lot of confusion because this request had been approved. The villagers believed their boundary was in one place, whereas the project and the forest monitors were understanding the boundary as being in a different place. And the forest monitors who were originally villagers or who are villagers, they don't have a legal education. So they understand the law to be what they're told by the people working in the project. So this is a quote from the village chairman of Sunuka. We clarified that Kazakati is our area for cultivation and our forest, confused and started with the putting of beacons. The beacons are used for marking the boundaries of the land. The officers who were dealing with putting the beacons went by their own decisions. So I won't read the rest of the quote out, I'll leave you to read it. But these photo is signboards that I found in the back of a classroom where people had taken the signboards down because they were not consenting to this project. Another quote from the wildlife officer's report: when the problems with evictions started, people went to their leaders and they wrote letters to the district, complaint letters. And after some time, the district responded by sending the division officer to investigate. And there's a lot of kind of mediation processes that didn't really mediate the conflict in the end because the power inequities are too great, one could assume. But the way the wildlife officer writes about the leaders is very revealing. He says, many suspects claim the chairman of Sunuka village was allowing farmers to cultivate, with claims that the border of the village had moved. And they kind of, they really complain about the chairman who was supporting their people, and they try to get them out of power, actually. So I've already talked about the process of letter writing, but the lack of recognition by district authorities relates to the institutional choice and recognition framework that I mentioned previously. The division officer is appointed, so this is deconcentration of power, and the division officer was quite sympathetic to the people, but he can't do anything. He has no leverage. And since there's resistance to conservation, the people are still cultivating where the project doesn't want them to cultivate. There's attempts to overthrow the project and no cooperation from the people. Is this a triple loss as opposed to a triple win? Because it's argued that these projects are making a triple win for conservation, livelihoods, and democracy. And a key finding in terms of recentralization processes is that Songambele Village General Assembly held a meeting in which the people decided to expel all the committees dealing with conservation, the environment, namely the CBO, Forest Monitors, and Environmental Committee, without following the legal procedure and not knowing the consequences that could appear in the future. So these notes were taken by the village executive officer, who's also appointed. But nevertheless, the districts appeared to take this seriously for a while, and there's letters saying this is not something to be taken lightly. But the following year, the evictions did resume. And another mechanism that they used to ignore this decision of the village was the ward council, because the ward council is formed of several villages, and they said, okay, this village doesn't agree, but we've got a majority because we've got 2 villages that haven't made such a decision. And so therefore the aggregation process of the community-based organizations that's created through REDD+, not only in this area but in other areas, has implications for the politics of scale and for democracy. So yes, Lomley et al. Has been working, well, Tom Lomley has been working for years on community-based forest management in Tanzania. And he compares the various pilot project sites and comments that his study has found no evidence that REDD has been recentralized. So that's in contrast to my own findings. So that's why I do feel it's important to highlight the recentralization processes in my analysis. He also writes, one project, JGI, which is this project, supported the emergence of new forms of forest management where previously unreserved forests were managed under an inter-village community-based organization. The absence of any recognized legal framework for this arrangement has, however, meant that by the end of the project, forest tenure for this area remains unresolved. So this was something I also found in my interviews with local experts, that they didn't find the land tenure arrangement to be valid. Like community-based forest management should be implemented on village land, not general land, or if it was on general land, then either the boundaries of the village should be extended to cover the project area, or a local area forest reserve should be created. And the process of creating a formal local area forest reserve took place after the REDD project was phased out. So what is this new form of forest management that's made as a test to see what would happen? Some other questions for discussion, which I'll just go through briefly. Yes, it's important to recognize that there's not only instrumental factors driving conflicts here, but there's also ideological motivations, the ideology for chimpanzee conservation, for instance, but nevertheless, instrumental incentives are quite significant, and the project needs money in order to implement such activities. Value grabbing, in other words, rent-seeking behavior by district officials, among other factors, has led to land grabbing, whereas they were willing to extend the village boundaries prior to REDD+. And how can equity mechanisms be established in such a case? There's some thoughts on that by Ribot et al. And Agrawal et Ribot, that effective decentralization requires the construction of accountable institutions at all levels of government and a secure domain of autonomous decision-making at local level. But how do we actually achieve that in practice? How can conflict prevention and mediation protocols be established? Complexity blinding has meant that the United Nations doesn't recognize forest carbon conflicts in the way that it would recognize an armed conflict. But there are extreme cases of militarization taking place in some areas. The trade-offs between conserving chimpanzee habitats can be very difficult. And when it comes to wildlife, managing wildlife and farming, there are issues that are very difficult to resolve because, for instance, an elephant could trample crops, and who compensates for that? Where do we draw the line? Is compensated relocation acceptable? This is just responding to Amber's recommendation that uncompensated relocation or involuntary relocation is unacceptable. But what if the communities agree to be relocated? In this case, they were not offered money to be relocated, but maybe there might be conditions in which they would accept, and in which circumstances, if at all, is that ethical? The compensated relocation does take place in Tanzania for governmental projects such as building electricity pylons, for instance. Why has no one divided the cake of wildlife tourism benefits? The wildlife sector remains centralized compared with forests. And lastly, but not least, political ecology and political geography, where do they intersect? Okay, thank you. I'll leave it to Amber.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was really, really interesting. And I like that you ended by not pointing out like a set of hard conclusions, but but the questions that arise from this context. I think that's really interesting. And a good way to finish a talk like this. So we'll take some time for questions and comments in the room, and also from people joining us on Zoom. We'll start by people who might be here presently, and that'll give other people time to type out any questions they might have.
Just giving our thumbs up.
Oh, I thought you were volunteering.
It's very much from the outside.
And could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Torla Vivsen. I'm actually a colleague of Emma, but we work at the same center, at the Center for the Study of the Sciences and Humanities at the University of Bergen. So we're actually close colleagues, and I've also been like a PhD candidate, the PhD candidate placement, so-called, here now for a couple of months, and I'm finishing tomorrow. So it was very nice to see a colleague come and have a presentation right before I finish. I think you did a very good job of outlining an incredibly complex and interesting case. I think I would just like to hear more about the term conservation ideology. What does that mean? So it would be interesting if you could unpack that a bit. Thanks.
Okay, let's see if anybody else has some questions before you respond, and then you can maybe respond together if they're related questions.
Yes, hello. Lars Ottones, fellow at REDD. Thank you for a fascinating and very rich presentation, Emma. I really enjoyed that. I'm sorry if I missed it, but I just had a question about whether how typical this case is for Tanzania. Specifically, were there conflicts preceding the establishment of REDD+ site in this area, and were some of these conflicts sort of prior to that, or did it all emerge as REDD+ was established?
Okay, shall I take that question?
I think we have one more, and then
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. One is Tanzania is part of Savannah, and we have a lot of pastoral communities. So how well these projects respect the is there a traditional route where pastoral communities go through, and are their rights respected? And since pastoral communities move around, they'll not be represented in local political structure decision making, whether that is taken into account. And I have another question. The notion of community, when I talk about local community is not a single unit. In itself, it has a lot of power structure, which is traditional, and also because of the new class that emerges. So how is that addressed in all these projects? When we talk about leaders, many times in local communities are those people who concentrate power through wealth, let's say land ownership or tenure, and people are forced to vote for them. It's not neutral. Even the election, in a way, even though it's free and fair, local communities are dependent on the leaders for economic existence. So whether that is recognized, and how well the gender roles are recognized here, and how women.
those are really good questions. Do you want to go ahead and take those, and then we'll take a few more? Just do 3 at a time.
Yeah. Conservation ideologies, that's acknowledging the fact. Well, I recently took a course on mediation and conflict, and we were discussing there that we need to acknowledge not only one rationality, there's multiple and plural rationalities. So what I mean is that it's not only money that's motivating the behavior of the actors in this case study, because the concept of value grabbing relates to money and instrumental forces. Rationality is bounded, so there's a belief that conservation should be protected. For example, the forest monitors received some small allowances, but they also received training where they were taken to a national park and could see the wildlife. And they were affected by this because many Tanzanians don't actually get that opportunity. It's people from outside, internationals, who get to go to the national parks. So that's what I mean. The belief
Mhm.
system.
But also, it's not just scientific either. Like, it's not just about money. It's not, and it's also not
Yes.
just about, you know,
Science.
some sort of objective science guiding.
Yeah,
planning
it's
as
an
well.
ethics, ethical sense.
Mhm.
This is what we should do. How common are conflicts in your case? Well, there were conflicts, and there were actually some accounts of some small evictions taking place previously to REDD+, but I didn't find documents. That was just from my interviews. There have also been in Kilosa, there was a master's thesis that also found the same results, that there's been evictions. And there's different kinds of conflicts. Like in Menesis's case, there were people arguing when they had a meeting. The debate got so heated that it broke into violence, according to her article from 2021.
She's right there.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
So should I go to the next question? Pastoralist communities. That's a very pertinent question. In this study area, there were agro-pastoralists. The main group is the Skuma, but there are some other agro-pastoralists and pastoralists that have migrated from Burundi, for instance. And that's going to be another paper, because I have another research about them. But they don't organize and mobilize themselves in the same way. They're transitory, and they don't often participate in the same political processes. Although, because they have income, they have a disposable income. If they have cattle, they can sell a cow and get disposable income. So there has been complaints that they can try to influence political processes using bribes, for instance. But in many senses, they are marginalized. Some are illiterate, and yeah, there's a very interesting dynamic there. And they were evicted by this project as well. Their cattle were seized, and they were affected. But because this paper is by recentralization processes, I will mention them and say that they were there and they weren't included. But I'm studying the structure, so for them to be described, they really need their own paper. And the concept of community really is homogenizing, because the interests of the community in building village infrastructure, the schools and village offices, that there were motivation payments, don't benefit the people who lost their livelihoods as a result of the project, because they live too far away. And actually, historically in Tanzania, this is not the first time we see these kind of dynamics, because there was a process called villagization, or Ujuma, which tried to concentrate the patterns of settlements.
Settlement policies.
Yeah, they wanted people to live close to services, but they found that people insisted on going where there's good farmland and further away. And James Scott has a chapter on this in Seeing Like a State, based on villagization in Tanzania. So he describes it quite well, and Melis also refers to this in her article on REDD Plus in Mindy.
Any other questions or follow-up?
Yeah, you
Or-
had one more question, I think, that we didn't.
I just like, if there is a REDD Plus project. Thank you.
Sorry.
One is, I mean, I didn't fully ask my question. It's about gender roles. Women are often entrenched into cooking and other things.
Yeah.
And cooking generally in many parts of the world, in poorer sections, it's firewood they have to go and collect. If my question is, in these areas, did you find if a REDD Plus project, I mean, if the area is demarcated for REDD Plus project, women will be prevented from, let's say, if they're traditionally taking their firewood from there. So did that affect women? And also, to what extent other problems of women are taken into context in local decision making? Because generally, I mean, I don't know what is the situation in Tanzania. It is coming from an uninformed perspective. Women participation is lower generally in lots of the world. I mean, in parts of the world. So I'm just asking to what extent that is considered, and how does these projects affect their life?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Tanzania has entrenched gender roles and traditional, what you could call traditional gender roles, but they do have women working within institutions such as the police. Not as many women as men, but they are there. But because the roles that men and women play are so different, there's many ways in which they've been affected, or in which their participation is not even or not the same. And when it comes to the violence, like women are particularly affected because, for instance, if a man loses his house, he can more easily relocate if he's just going by himself to work than a woman can relocate when she has to take all her children together with her and look after them, and try to protect them in the new surroundings and new circumstances. I have a colleague called Lucy Massoy who wrote her PhD thesis about this, and who continues to work on gender, so I can refer you to that work if anybody's interested. Yeah, so gender has to be taken into account in all aspects. I mentioned this in the methodology, but it's not really a focus of the study. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
You said that the research area was in an area mainly of subsistence farmers. Are any of the other REDD Plus projects in Tanzania located in areas which are mainly sort of agribusiness areas, or where there's large scale agribusiness happening, or is it again mainly within sort of subsistence areas where there's a lot of small villages?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Should I answer it now, or?
Does
Yeah.
anybody else have a question at the moment? Oh, someone online?
Yeah, you have two questions
Okay.
online, if you'd like to hear them now or after in person. Yes, we got a question.
Okay.
Yeah. Would you agree that a link between political geography and political ecology is that they both contribute to complexity unblinding, i.e. counteracting the complexity blinding that we see from, for example, the economists working on REDD? And then your second question is, I know it's unrelated to the issue ongoing with Maasai eviction in northeastern part, But what would you generally say on the government enforcement gaps despite a good decentralized administration structure? Since land conservation is a common excuse in both cases, what is the relation to biodiversity conservation efforts, and is there a significant impact on the progress?
Okay, I think you can see it if you click on the chat as well, maybe. Or maybe not.
No, I can't see any
Okay.
questions.
Well, the first was,
Yeah, I should point out that in this study area, fishing is also a major source of livelihoods, although I didn't mention it in the presentation itself. So thanks for the question. Increasingly in Tanzania, there are attempts to make projects such as the Derema corridor, agribusiness corridor. I don't know to which extent that those areas were involved with REDD+, but from what I know, REDD+ kind of may have avoided some of the processes that were going on through the mechanism of working with NGOs that have particular study sites where they work and not taking into account REDD+ did not go through the Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism in Tanzania, except for around 5% of the funding that was channeled through Finnish donor agencies. And in my paper, I argue that this was due to a corruption scandal during the time of REDD+. But that relates to institutional choice and also the theme of special issue. Yeah.
there was the comment about political ecology and political geography.
Well, complexity blinding was a concept I took from, we can say, the borders of political ecology and ecological economics, which do have a symbiosis. But in different disciplines, it might be similar processes might have different terms such as depoliticization, unmasking, or rendering technical by Tenure Land. So yeah, these are different languages for similar processes. And I think they're observed within several disciplines. And should I come
the
and
third question?
Third question. I know it's unrelated to the issue ongoing with Maasai eviction in the northeastern part, but what would you generally say on the government's enforcement gaps despite a good decentralized administration structure? Since land conservation is a common excuse in both cases, what is the relation to biodiversity conservation efforts, and is there any significant impact on the progress?
Yeah, these are similar patterns in a sense. As I mentioned, the Maasai are a pastoralist group, whereas the Skuma that I talked about previously are agro-pastoralists. And historically, the Maasai and the Skuma don't mix hardly at all. So it's different actors involved, but maybe some of the same legal mechanisms or same justifications and discourses. Well, yes. Does that answer the question? No, I can't see the person who asked it.
They have had a follow-up. To be a bit more specific, to what extent does REDD or other conservation programs in Tanzania compensate for wider causes of ecosystem destruction and total amount of damage done by anthropogenic action?
To what extent does it compensate? That's a very interesting question, because the the peasants who were evicted in this case study were not compensated, and they tried to claim for legal aid unsuccessfully because they don't have the resources to pay lawyers and various other reasons, and they're trying to go against an international organization who has much more resources and power than they do. So there was an unsuccessful attempt for them to claim compensation. The Commission for Human Rights and Good Governance was also involved as a part of this research. I introduced them to the farmers, and from there on they said that we want to work with them independently of my research project, so I left them to it.
To what extent do you think?
Does REDD+ compensate for global anthropogenic climate change? Well, the term anthropogenic masks the inequities that are present within the climate change debate. So
Some of what you were talking about when you were talking about issues of compensation.
yes, so the people weren't compensated, but REDD+ seemed, from their perspective, the REDD+ seemed to have made the situation worse. Other villagers would approve of the project because some people benefited from them. A lot of villagers did benefit. They got their schools, they got their village offices, they got workshop training. So there's winners and losers, and the scale of the funding is tiny compared to what went into the transaction costs and the mensuration processes, like measuring trees and the technical capacity that was needed for the project implementation. So it doesn't compensate for global anthropogenic climate change, and from a selected view, it's made the situation from a selected group of actors, it's made the situation worse. Yes,
Hey, Emma, really great work, really detailed field work, amazing.
thank you.
Yeah, so I have a very brief question. It's mainly regarding the district, people, and to what extent or which forms of collaboration exist there between the NGO and the district, because that seems to be quite important in terms of your framing of what is decentralization, recentralization, right? And there is a dynamic there, I think, that is also kind of related to all sorts of issues, including zoning, for example.
Yeah.
So maybe related to that is the categories of land, for example, like general land, village land, etc. How far these play out in the eviction process? Do they play at all a role? Because they are extremely flexible and plastic. They're not set in stone and closely related also to the planning process. What do you think?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. There certainly was a collaboration between the district authorities and the NGO, and this is something that NGO would definitely try to underplay. But it's extremely important for the case, and maybe I haven't emphasized it enough in the article. Not only my case study, the work of analysts such as Dan Brockington, who's worked extensively on conservation. Brockington and Ego wrote Eviction for Conservation, a global overview in which they discuss exactly this point, and other studies. So in my case, there's the question of posho in Tanzania, the allowances that people are paid for attending workshops. They're making projects together. And not all of these flows or financial flows are easy to trace or to prove, but it's clear they're working together. When you interview them, you say, yes, we're working with them on the project. They are involved in workshops, they're invited to things. Yes, and this undermines democratic processes, because then the district government has a huge incentive to pay more attention to what an international organization wants than the village level people who are poor people and don't have such resources to incentivize them. So there need to be more external mediation processes involved in different accountability mechanisms, or maybe the inequities are too great for this to be something that can work. That's an open question. I don't have the answer exactly to how to solve it.
Any follow-up questions online or?
Yeah, one from Lydia Cabral. To what extent are these experiences of REDD+ project changing villagers' understandings of how they relate to nature, examples, forest, animals, subsoil, and helping address tensions between nature and human agencies? Is this an area where political ecology and pole geography can usefully dialogue?
So how do projects affect people's relationships with nature,
Yes.
like animals and soils and things?
That's an interesting question, because there were some projects or some workshops made to try to improve livelihoods, like improve agriculture, beekeeping activities, and the like. But they seem to have gone to a select group of people that were invited to the workshops, like environmental committee members. So we call this elite capture in the literature when the benefits go to a few people. So in terms of certain actors, such as the forest monitors, I already mentioned the example of them receiving training. It has improved their relationship with nature, and that's part of what's motivating them to evict their fellow villagers, or to collaborate in the eviction of their fellow villagers, but they haven't succeeded in getting the majority to understand them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think because the second half of her question was about how that's related to, I guess, political geography and political ecology. But I actually have a question that's relevant as well that I would like to ask.
Okay.
That's kind of related. So people often ask about, because there are lots of assumptions about people who get involved in forestry projects on the local level, you know, whether it be the homogenizing ideas about community or ideas about people's like religious or, you know, spiritual connections to forests and land and things like that. And, you know, we always get the question of, you know, how are these projects changing, you know, the relationships between people and nature kind of in a spiritual or convivial sense.
Mhm.
I think it's also, and I'm asking what you think about this in relation, important to ask, how these projects are changing, how, and I think your project does emphasize this, but how these projects are changing relationships between people and people as well. Because I think it has really important implications to think about how, you know, the relations that are changed aren't just between people and a project or people and some kind of external nature, but also, you know, within the ostensible community.
Yeah, there's definitely lots of changing relationships, both between the different actor groups in this project, which are very complex, and changing roles with nature. The interesting thing about this project actually is that although people have not very recently arrived, there are many migrants, and one of the complaints is that the people who are moving into the forest were originally coming. There's a refugee camp very close to this area, which has taken refugees from Burundi and the Rwanda conflict. So there isn't like that. Many of the people in the village were not originally an indigenous group, and they don't have that indigenous identity or connection with the land. And in terms of the REDD+ safeguards, indigenous rights are explicitly mentioned, but I think these findings highlight the need for human rights to be respected, regardless of whether a citizen is indigenous or not. And the other part of the question, in terms of changing relationships with nature, some of the affected farmers, interestingly, got a hold of some of the project materials, and they said, we want to form our beekeeping group and we want to have some workshops, but they weren't recognized because they weren't the target group for having that funding. So they wanted to be included in the workshop training, and they weren't. But it would be very interesting to see if the selection had been different, would they have accepted to, like they might have, if the trade-off is such that there is a hard trade-off, I think they would have accepted to go to another place with the right support, with like livelihood training and proper investment in it, because they don't have a strong spiritual connection to that study area in particular. Whereas in other cases, like in Latin America or Colombia, there's groups that have their ancestral lands in their territory and have a very strong connection to a place. But in this case study, that wasn't the case. Yeah, and I could go on about the different actor groups, but that would, and how their relationships change, because there's all kinds of relationships, like cooperation between some groups, like the project leader cooperated. The project leader came from outside of the NGO that created the project because he had some technical capacities that they didn't have. So the project was very transitory, and the team went off to do different things. They were like consultants after the project finished. But there was an interesting competition between the project director and the people working in the NGO, and they ended up getting their own offices, and all kinds of different shifting relationships. Like for another example is the conflict, bringing the support of the village leaders or mobilizing support of various people, or people forming alliances to help them deal with these challenges, or the communities reaching out. They even wrote a letter to the president at some point in the case study after they've already written to the district and the district isn't answering their complaint. They went to the higher levels. They tried to go to the region. They tried to go to the president. There's all kinds of different relations taking place in the story of the case study that I don't really have time to go into in one paper.
Well, you'll write a book, right, eventually. All right. Any follow-ups? Well, if not, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Emma. It's been really interesting, and yeah, it's a great chance to get together after so long. So thanks, everyone.